afternoon, and thank you for everybody that was able to make it today. This is our first event of the semester for our curriculums and working groups. So we're excited to have this topic based on capitalism. And just as a reminder for those of you that aren't familiar with policy for the people, we believe in policy for the people with an understanding that a majority of people are not adequately represented in policy, and that policy has historically disenfranchised and marginalized the poor, working class, BIPOC, queer, trans, feminine, differently abled, immigrant, and other minorities. We believe that upholding and pursuing the status quo is an acceptance of this marginalization, this violence. We strive for a different kind of policy that identifies and seeks to change structural inequalities and injustice. This organization serves as a place to learn, to teach, and find refuge. So I'd like to give a warm virtual welcome to our two guests today. First, I'd like to introduce the economist, Dr. William, aka Sandy Darity, who is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy at Stanford, with a focus on areas such as inequality and stratification economics. He most recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Triangle Business Journal's Leader in Diversity, and is also the author of a recently released book with Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. We're pleased to have you join us today, and we're looking forward to learning from you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce the political scientist, Dr. Thomas Craemer, who is an awesome professor of public policy at the University of Connecticut. He is an expert in research areas relevant to the psychology of race, public opinion, and survey research, and slavery reparations. He is the author, along with Dr. Darity and other scholars, on the upcoming Wealth Implications of Slavery and Racial Discrimination for African American descendants of the enslaved, and the author of the forthcoming publication, Holocaust and Slavery Reparations. We're also pleased to have you join us today and look forward to learning from you as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, I'd like to start out with some questions for Dr. Darity, so we can all kind of get on the same page and get a little bit more acquainted with the concept of stratification economics. So Professor Darity, if you could tell us a little bit more about that and give us a little bit more information about how it shapes American socioeconomics and politics.
Okay, small question. I began to do work on what I came to call stratification economics. Oh, there's feedback. Let me see if I use my headphones. Is that better? Okay. I came to begin to do work on what I labeled stratification economics in around 2004, 2005. I was asked to give a talk at the meeting of an organization that was having a convening in Charleston, South Carolina. And in the process, I began to think about what I viewed as one of the central problems with the way in which economics approaches problems of inequality, but particularly intergroup inequality. And I was convinced that there was such a strong emphasis on what I would refer to as cultural or behavioral explanations for disparities, that we needed something that would be quite different from that. We needed an analytical framework that didn't depend in any way whatsoever on explanations for intergroup disparity, that relied upon the claim that there were some locked-in behavioral differences between groups that explain why we observe these disparities. And so that's what motivated me for the development of the talk that was subsequently published in the Journal of Economics and Business, that has as its primary title stratification economics. And the premise here is twofold about the kind of core assumptions that shape this approach. The first is that human beings are much more concerned about their relative status than they are about their absolute status. This is not this is not a particularly fresh insight. You can find it in particular in Thorstein Veblen's theory of the leisure class, quite explicitly laid out that there's a desire to think of your own position as being better than that of the individuals who constitute your peer group or your comparison group, and that's a greater source of satisfaction than just knowing that you're absolutely well off. Okay. And so that was the first piece of it. It's something that has been a dramatic dimension of research that's been done on human happiness. Richard Easterlin many years ago made the claim that individuals are not necessarily happier because their absolute levels of income or some measure of well-being has gone up. They're actually happier if they believe that their level of income or well-being has gone up relative to the other individuals who they're using for comparative purposes. Now, what's the kicker with stratification economics is the argument that the comparison group is not simply your immediate peers, but it's also the social group with whom you identify as the other, the group that is outside of the social group that you personally identify with. And so, so individual satisfaction is also attributable to whether or not you think that the social group to which you belong, the team or the tribe or the side that you're on, is doing better than the side that you're not on, that the side that in some sense you're opposed to. Ultimately in stratification economics, the premise is that at the individual level, a person is concerned, A, about how well their social group or team is doing in comparison with others, and B, they're concerned about how well they personally are doing in comparison with other members of their own team. And so those are the two weighted factors that shape human attitudes and outlooks. And as a consequence, when we start thinking about things like the election of 2016, where people frequently have juxtaposed concerns about economic anxiety against concerns about racial status, the stratification economics would propose that you don't have to make that distinction, that the two factors or considerations are actually very well integrated. Once you take into account that individuals who are concerned not only about how well they're doing relative to other members of their social group or their peer group in some sense, but they're also concerned about how their social group is doing in comparison with others, to the extent that they perceive that their social group is falling behind relative to the other, they're going to support certain kinds of actions or policies that might inhibit the opportunities for the others if they have the capacity or power to do that. And really the critical term here is perception, because it's not necessarily a question of whether or not their identity group is doing better or worse than the other. The question is whether or not they think that their identity group is doing better or worse than the other. And this perceptual dimension is very, very important because actually one of the things that we demonstrate in our book, From Here to Equality, in the second chapter of the book, is the scope of false beliefs that people have about the scope and the magnitude of inequality by race, but also the false beliefs that they have about the causes of such inequality. And it is very clear that a significant number of Americans, both black and white, actually believe that there are no differences in terms of economic status between blacks and whites. Moreover, there are some who believe that blacks are actually better off today. And so if you're a member of the white social group who has that perception and who has concern about the white social group's relative status, then you may well endorse candidates or policies that you think will take the steps to put the other group back in its place. And so there is economic anxiety, but there's economic anxiety in the context of perception of relative status. There is also racial status concerns because you know, your central objective is to make sure that the group to which you belong stays ahead in the game, and perhaps significantly ahead in the game. Last thing I'll say at the outset is that there's a hypothesis that has emerged from this, that to the extent that the disparities between groups are perceived as being small, then there is much more of a concern about the relative position of the groups. To the extent that those disparities are perceived as wide, then there's much more attention that individuals give to their relative position in comparison with members of their own group. Well, let me add one more thing. There's been a tremendous amount of interest recently in the case of a scholar named Jessica Krug, who has confessed that she was passing as black for many years. It's pretty obvious why people might pass as white, but one wonders why somebody would pass as a member of a socially marginalized group. And in a paper that I did with Kristen Brody and Curtis Todd, we tried to examine what were some potential explanations for this apparent paradox. And we argued that the frame of stratification economics could provide an answer. If it was possible for an individual from the dominant social group to perceive themselves as having a relatively mediocre status within their own group, but perceiving that they could have a relatively elevated status if they were in the marginalized group. And so under those circumstances, if they have the markers that would allow them to make such a change or transition, they might on occasion make that decision. But it's rare, in large part because even the folks who are at the lowest end of the distribution of the dominant social group may receive certain benefits that are not available to virtually any of the members of the marginalized group. And one illustration of this is your treatment with respect to your treatment at the hands of the police and with respect to the criminal justice system. It doesn't really matter much where, if you're black, you lie upon the hierarchy of status in the black community. You're going to be treated badly. Okay, and that's much less of the case, regardless of where you lie upon the status ranking in the white community. So that's just one illustration, but you know, barring those kinds of benefits at the lower end of the distribution in the dominant social group, there may be a few individuals who choose to cross over to the marginalized group because they perceive that the status advantages within that group outweigh whatever they're going to lose by distancing themselves from the dominant social group. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's synoptic treatment.
Thank you. And Dr. Thomas Craemer, if you want to chime in, I'd be curious to hear about your experiences growing up in Germany, and just hearing a lot more about your work in terms of implicit attitudes as well in your research.
Okay, thank you. The experience of growing up in Germany was really formative for me with regard to my research interests. This is why I'm interested in racial policies and racial attitudes, race relations generally. I grew up at a time when the Holocaust was discussed in every school subject, maybe not in physical education, but in everything else. It was discussed at length. And of course, if you grow up as a young German, you feel ashamed of your country. And you see these documentaries, you identify with what went on. And then I talked to my grandparents and asked them, where were you? What did you do? Or why didn't you do anything? Yeah, so I wanted to understand better how racial attitudes are formed and how they change, if they even can change. And so when I came to the United States, I figured that the United States is an ideal laboratory to conduct this kind of research, because here you have people from all over the world in one country. You have a history of severe institutional racism, but you also have a counter history of an abolitionist movement that was fairly interracial, and a civil rights movement, and so on. So those were elements that were missing in Germany. In Germany, there was barely any opposition. And so I thought that it was really a good opportunity to learn more about racial attitudes in the United States. And so I've been doing research on racial attitudes, especially attitudes towards African Americans, and found out two things. First, there is a deeply ingrained implicit anti-Black bias that we all share as Americans. It doesn't matter what group you belong to. I found it even among African American students and general members of the general public, that they recognized negative words faster after a picture of an unknown Black person than after an unknown white person. And they recognize positive words faster after an unknown white person than after an unknown Black person. And this is at milliseconds. People don't even know that they see pictures on the screen. The computer screen just looks like it flickers briefly. And later on, I show them the pictures and ask, have you ever seen this face? And people say no. But it's enough for their brains to recognize that, make that distinction of a Black versus a white face and to respond differentially. So I became very concerned with that. Does that mean that attitudes are not changeable? And on the other hand, I also wanted to know, how come there was always this counter movement in the United States? There were some, not too many, but there were some white Americans who fought for the abolitionist movement. I'm thinking of John Brown, for example, who identified with the African American cause to the degree that he gave his life and that of his sons in the uprising at Harper's Ferry, by which he hoped to abolish slavery in the United States. That's an extreme example, but of course there were more rank and file members that worked on the Underground Railroad. So there were definitely always some. So I used a measure of, and this probably goes or shows an alternative to the mechanism that Professor Darity just outlined, because I looked for a mechanism by which members of the dominant group may identify with the political goals of the oppressed group, at an implicit level. So you ask them in the survey, how much do you care about African Americans, or how much do you identify with African Americans? And they say, not very much. I'm white, you know, so I don't feel too close. But on the implicit level, on a measure of closeness towards African Americans, I can see that some white Americans, regardless of their political background, identify with African Americans, and if they do, they are much more likely to support affirmative action or government aid to minorities, and even slavery reparations, than if they don't identify closely on that measure. Of course, so that gives me hope. That means there is some psychological mechanism by which we can overcome those racial distinctions, but I don't know where it's coming from and how you can encourage it. So there is still some research to be done in this area. The reason I've moved away from implicit racial attitudes research lately is that I've become so interested in the question of reparations, because to me it felt most of the research on implicit racial attitudes says these associations are basically almost hardwired in our brains. If we grow up in this culture, there's a lot of self-reinforcing stereotypes against African Americans and anti-Black attitudes, you know, that from the local news and whatnot, the images you see, so that that I feel there has to be a change on the material level. There has to be the wealth gap needs to be addressed and needs to be eliminated, and then the attitudes, I assume, will follow, because all of a sudden it will be very desirable to be in African American neighborhoods. The businesses will look to these neighborhoods. Local governments will look to these neighborhoods for taxation purposes and provide services. So I think when there is a change at the material level, that those attitudes will adjust afterwards. Of course, this is only a hypothesis, but that's roughly my trajectory of how I arrived at the question of reparations. And I should also mention, I'm not an economist, so I'm being like a fish out of water here in a discussion about economics and capitalism and so on.
I definitely understand. I think that there's a lot of intersections between economics and psychology and the work that you do. So thank you for sharing. Just in terms of material, Professor Darity, if you could give us a little bit more information about Reconstruction era policies and things like the Homestead Act and their legacy in terms of how this gap manifested.
So this is not going to be directly connected to stratification economics, and I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to talk further with Professor Craemer about that we have tended to approach this from different ends of the spectrum, where I've been more focused on animus towards Blacks, and he has been more focused on trying to understand instances where folks from the dominant social group are actually supportive of the members of the marginalized group. I think there's much for me to learn in trying to better understand some of the findings that he's had. But since I've been largely focused on the question of animus toward the marginalized community, it's influenced the way in which I've thought about the significance of the Reconstruction era in the United States. I have the view, which is shared by my co-author Kirsten Mullen, and it's a view that we expound upon in From Here to Equality, that there's been a number of instances in which the United States had the opportunity to move in the direction of full inclusion of Black Americans as comprehensive citizens in the United States, rather than citizens who have an incomplete status with respect to their legal position within the United States. And so a number of these instances have taken place. They can be viewed as forks in the road, and consistently the United States has taken the wrong fork. The first important instance is at the formation of the nation in 1776, when the decision is made in a formal way to break with the British Empire. And it was possible at that point to conceive of making the hard decision. It's a hard decision that might have meant that not all of the 13 colonies would have joined the Exodus. And that could have had some implications for the potential for military success. But nonetheless, it was a potential option, and it was not chosen. And so the United States forms in 1776 as a slave republic. So that's the first crossroad that was missed. A second crossroad actually occurs in the run-up to the Civil War, where there actually was an opportunity to both eliminate slavery and to avoid civil conflict. And that opportunity was embodied in a project that was referred to as compensated emancipation. And Kirsten and I talk about that in detail in chapter 5 of the book, that there were a number of instances in which overtures were made to the slaveholding classes in the South, that were made to them to actually emancipate their human property by receiving compensatory payments from the federal government. And these overtures were consistently rebuffed. No significant effort was ever made to negotiate over what the price might be. The South was fully committed to doing whatever it could to preserve slavery, and that included an eventual decision, which was contested within the South, but an eventual decision to secede from the Union. But there's no question that there was widespread support for maintaining the system of slavery in the South, particularly among white Southerners. And so there's another fork in the road where slavery could have ended, and it could have ended without a massive civil war, but that step was not taken. So the Reconstruction era, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, provides another period in which it was possible to bring Black Americans into full citizenship in the United States. And this was to be accomplished by doing two things: by guaranteeing Blacks the right to participate in the electoral process. And I'd like to be a little bit precise here. We're talking about allowing Black men to be full participants in the electoral process because women in general were not allowed to vote at that point. But it would have given Black engagement in the political process the same status as white engagement if it had been carried through. And then the second major thing that was one of the objectives of the Reconstruction period, besides full involvement of Black male voters in the political process, was the provision of land grants of some sort. And in fact, there's, in Black American folklore, there's a continuous reference to 40 acres and a mule. Well, this reference to 40 acres and a mule is one that is not rooted in the Black imagination. It is a folkloric reference that has a corresponding reality. This really was a promise that was made to the formerly enslaved. It was a promise that took the form of a commitment to provide them with allocation of tracts of land as restitution for their years of enslavement. and this was not fulfilled. It's a promise that went unmet, and it actually creates the foundations for an unmet debt for 155 years that we are still bearing the repercussions. At the same time that Black Americans were not provided with the 40 acres upon emancipation, significant tracts of land were actually being allocated to white families in the western part of the United States, in territories that had been effectively seized from the native population. These 160-acre land grants were provided under the terms of the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act's operation lasted approximately 70 years. It's estimated that at least 1.5 white families received the benefits of these land allocations, and that today at least 45 million living white Americans. That's a total number of persons that's comparable to the total number of Black Americans in the United States. 45 million white Americans or so are the living beneficiaries of the land allocations that took place under the Homestead Acts. So I would argue that that's the beginning point for the immense racial wealth differentials that we observe today. I mean, clearly you could argue that the wealth divide actually begins during the period of enslavement, because Black people were not allowed, enslaved Black people for the most part, were not allowed to accumulate property. They were, in fact, somebody else's property. But you can argue that all of those conditions could have been dramatically changed during the Reconstruction era had significant land allocations been made to Black Americans. In fact, Kirsten and I speculate that we wouldn't be having a conversation about reparations today. We wouldn't need to have one had the Reconstruction era actually played out in the way in which it was supposed to. But Reconstruction was overthrown by a violent white terror campaign that carried over for the subsequent 100 years or so following the end of the Civil War. This white terror campaign actually operated from the end of the Civil War largely up until the middle of the World War II years. And it involved marauding bands of whites who would attack Black neighborhoods and Black communities. They would murder Black folks. They would either destroy their property or appropriate their property. So what property Black folks had managed to accumulate during the course of the period after the end of the Civil War, despite not having received any form of restitution, even that property was frequently taken away from them. And so some of you may be familiar, of course, with the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, which is probably the one that's most familiar. But there was also the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. Recently, I've been doing a lot of work on the Elaine Massacre of 1919. And the year 1919 was referred to as the Red Summer because there were upwards of 30 to 35 of these massacres that took place in American localities, both north and south, rural and urban. The one that may be most familiar to folks may be the Chicago riot of 1919. But there was a horde of these events, and they were horrific events, and they were events that further contributed to widening the divide between Black and white property holdings. The subsequent forks in the road are associated with the policies that were introduced in the 20th century to build wealth or to build a middle class. And these are policies that that were focused on home buying or home ownership. In the 19th century, the primary focus of wealth accumulation was centered on land ownership. But in the 20th century, it has focused much more heavily on home ownership. I would argue that it's important to recognize that this is the way in which folks at the middle of the wealth distribution are most likely to have acquired assets, is through the purchase of a home. But it is also important to note that people at the upper end of the wealth distribution, particularly the upper 25%, for them, home buying is not a very significant component of their portfolio. Much more important is real estate, which returns us to the importance of land acquisition in the 19th century. And then, of course, having access to a substantial portfolio of financial assets that have incurred phenomenal appreciation, particularly after the 1950s in the United States. So, so what were these policies with respect to home ownership that also represented a failure to take the proper fork in the road? One of these policies was the New Deal legislation, which was applied in a discriminatory fashion against Blacks. Another was the GI Bill, which was intentionally structured to be administered in a decentralized fashion to give local authorities the capacity to determine which veterans would be beneficiaries of the legislation. And the consequence was that that this was disproportionately beneficial to whites, and in the state of Mississippi in particular, the returning veterans, upwards of 3,500 returning veterans, only 2 of them who were Black received benefits that were associated with home ownership or home buying benefits. And so, so the argument that I would make is that at every stage where there was an opportunity to make America a comprehensively just society, those opportunities were not taken.
And Dr. Craemer, if you'd like to chime in. And if you want to add anything, maybe just kind of about any discrepancies or differences for how these things are kind of like digested in terms of like narrative. Is it kind of like a national culture kind of narrative, or anything like that? If you could kind of.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can speak to that, but I wanted to just quickly get back to the 40 acres and a mule, because Professor Darity said it was a promise, and that is definitely true, but it actually was reality for some, I think some 40,000 Black families who received land under Sherman's Field Orders 15. So the land was actually already distributed in these 40-acre plots. And the land was then taken away from these families and actively returned to the former slave owners by President Andrew Johnson. I find that example so scandalous that I just wanted to briefly comment on that.
Yeah, I think that, let me add, I think people, it was 40,000 formerly enslaved folks who were settled on approximately 400,000 acres.
Yeah.
People frequently think that that is the entire scope of the land allocation that was designated in Sherman's Special Orders number 15. But that's not correct. It was actually a total of 5.3 million acres. It was a swath of land stretching from Charleston and the Sea Islands to northern Florida. and it would be a swath of land that was a 30-mile band coming in from the ocean. So the 400,000 acres was actually a very, very small share of the total that was intended under Sherman's special order. But you're absolutely correct. Andrew Johnson, who I would describe as the worst president the United States ever had, reversed the policy. And he's the individual who most systematically restored the authority and power of the former Confederates throughout the South. Rather than treating them as traitors, he actually restored them to positions of political authority and ultimately supported their efforts to restore a social order that looked as close as it could to what occurred before slavery ended.
Right. And then another historical nugget that I find quite interesting is that compensated emancipation did happen in the United States, although only in the District of Columbia. But in order for Lincoln, in order to abolish slavery there, slave owners were actually paid by the federal government during a major war effort, where every cent counted towards towards victory. Slave owners in Washington, D.C. were compensated to the tune of $300 per enslaved person. And, you know, it boggles the mind that that was possible at the time. And today we're talking about reparations and, oh no, it's too much and we can't do it and the economy won't allow it and this and that. And they did it during a war effort. As long as the recipients are white, these reparations efforts, you know, come to fruition. It's only when the recipients are black, there is suddenly all these problems about infeasibility. So I just wanted to throw this in. You mentioned something about narratives. I'm not sure if I understand you correctly, but I think an important part of a reparations program would be to change the narrative that has evolved in the United States, largely under the influence of President Wilson, who is another pretty awful president, where basically historians in the 1920s were rewriting the history of slavery and of the Civil War to write slavery out of the history and make it about a conflict among the states about states' rights. African Americans were completely written out of the history, and interestingly also the Haitian Revolution was written out of American history. And I think this is a major omission because I would argue, and I have to say I'm not a historian, but I would be curious to see historical work on that. My reading of the Haitian Revolution is that it was that event that basically gave oxygen to the emerging abolitionist movement. There were some abolitionists before that in Britain and some in the United States, but for it to become a mass movement, it really took the Haitian Revolution to show that Africans were not willing to bear the conditions of slavery, and that they overthrew it and successfully. And of course, this was a thorn in the side of Southern slave aristocracy. So it had to be written out of history. And that was basically accomplished in the 1920s during the height of Jim Crow. All the founding fathers said something about Toussaint Louverture, and I have a picture. I don't know if you can see it. I have a picture in the background that he was compared to Napoleon. What Napoleon was for Europe, Toussaint Louverture was for the Americas. The abolition of slavery in Latin America was largely due to the Haitian revolutionary founding fathers telling Simon Bolivar, we will give you support and soldiers if you make sure that slavery is abolished in the new independent states. And they did that. So Haiti had a much larger impact on American history than we give it credit for. So to me, that would be important in a reparations restructuring of the historical narrative to both write African American history back into the history of the Civil War, often omitted the African American soldiers who fought for the abolition of slavery on the Union side, and then the Haitian case as well.
Yeah, I would add that the two organizations that were most active in the process of crafting a narrative of America's past that put the folks who formed the Confederacy and led the Confederacy into a more heroic posture were the members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the members of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they actively not only solicited textbooks that would serve the purposes of providing the story that they preferred, but in instances where they were unable to identify authors who would write textbooks that were satisfactory to them, they wrote the textbooks themselves. And From Here to Equality, we refer to this process as the creation of dismemory. And it led to a phenomenon that is distinct from what has occurred in Germany. Although I guess there are some debates over how successful Germany still is at the process of maintaining the negative status of the Nazis. But I think Germany, to a large degree, did attempt to undergo a process that we might call denazification. So you did not have the erection. I see Thomas is shaking his head a bit. But,
I'll say something afterwards.
But you did not have, to the best of my knowledge, widespread erections of statues memorializing the Nazi leaders. In the United States, we have had tons of statues, both North and South, that actually celebrate the traitors of the Confederacy. And so this is a consequence of the way in which dismemory has operated in the United States.
Yeah, I find it a fascinating example that the United States, to my knowledge, is the only country where that usual trope is wrong, that the victors write the history.
Yeah.
And they did it so successfully. And it was the Daughters of the Confederacy, I think, also that put up these statues all over the place, and relatively late, like in the 1900s to 1920s, those statues that are now falling down and being removed in some cases. I was cringing a little bit with the denazification comment because the two Germanys undertook very different ways of dealing with history. East Germany was ruled by anti-Nazis, socialists who had been imprisoned in concentration camps and who definitely had a pure anti-Nazi pedigree. Right. In West Germany, under American influence, there was talk of denazification, but it never actually happened. Rather, the American military officials issued certificates of innocence, or whatever you could call them, to former Nazis or Nazi party members, so that they could enter public service again, because there was a shortage of people in the administration. And they were interested in building up West Germany as quickly as possible as a counterbalance to East Germany. So when I grew up, we had a lot of governors and politicians that actually were Nazi party members. And for example, in my home state of Baden-Württemberg, we had a governor who was known to have designed concentration camps as an architect and so on. I mean, it's really insane. But what did happen is that an anti-Nazi popular culture emerged, grew from the bottom up in West Germany, where there were protesting cases like that, and then scouring the local archives and trying to expose people like that, but also finding out what happened to Jewish properties. And now you find this movement of the Stolpersteine, that means literally translated stumbling blocks, which is where people can do research on Jewish properties or people who victims of the Holocaust, and donate money and have bronze cobblestones put into the sidewalk in front of these properties to commemorate them. And this is popping up all over Germany, all over Europe, actually. You see these Stolpersteine, these bronze cobblestones with information on the former owners and stuff like that. These are very much bottom-up initiatives. And I think that's something that I would like to see in the growing up in the United States regarding slavery. I think, however, that the one thing that I always envied the United States about, maybe a barrier to this, and that's the fact that half of the country was on the side of abolitionism and finally succeeded in abolishing slavery without foreign intervention. So there's always positive role models to cling on to, and people can say, well, we identify with Lincoln and with abolitionism and stuff, and they ignore the fact that they may be descended from slave owners. So the fact that you have positive role models here in the United States makes it less likely that the negative role models will be pointed out in sufficient detail. Whereas in Germany, we don't have any positive role models. I mean, there was literally, it was overwhelmingly Nazi, and we have to live with that history and we have to come to terms with it. So I think that's probably one of the main differences between the two instances.
Well, I think it's also interesting that in the context of, well, essentially it was West Germany that provided reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, that at the point in which the Bundestag made the decision to approve of a reparations project, I believe it was only about 20% of West Germans who actually endorsed reparations for the former victims of the Holocaust. So that Germany is also an extraordinary case where there was negligible popular support for reparations, but in fact a reparations program was put into place. I think it's absolutely impossible for the United States to adopt a reparations project without having significant popular support.
That's true.
Yeah.
And in Germany also, reparations came first, and only later came the fact, a generation or two later came the movement to deal with history, to go to the archives, to check it out yourself, and to protest and to ask your ancestors, your grandparents' generation what they did.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lag. Reparations came first. But I think that may have been based on Germany's experience after World War I, where it had to pay war reparations, so that Germans after World War II were probably expecting to have to pay significant reparations, and then were surprised when that was never demanded. And therefore, when the government finally negotiated with Israel about Holocaust reparations, people probably just took it as inevitable. But it's true that there was no, I mean, historians say that the public opinion or the public reaction in Germany was very muted. Nobody really paid attention to it. Whereas in Israel, interestingly, there was a massive movement against reparations.
Right.
So in Israel, there was a feeling that Israel was losing its honor by accepting to negotiate with Germany, and Menachem Begin held speeches that were very, very anti-reparations and very passionate. So it's an interesting historical case.
Thank you both. I know that we're pretty close on time at 2:30, but I also want to, if anybody in the participant group wants to ask any questions or add anything, please feel free.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
I guess
Yes.
just one quick question is, like, how can we, as people interested in policy and all of that, or as a society, make the concept of reparations more palatable to the public? I mean, obviously it'd be very expensive. How do we make it clear that like whatever the expense is, like I think you mentioned 14 trillion, Dr. Craemer. Like, how do we make it clear that it's worth it to the American public, especially the white public?
Well, I'm not sure. The only thing I can say is, we could design a reparations project in such a way that it would not actually increase the tax burden for any American, white, black, or otherwise. So I can't necessarily say that enacting a reparations project will be beneficial to whites, but we could design it in such a way that we minimize the cost to whites of doing it. And we talk about that in the final chapter of From Here to Equality, ways in which to design it. I start with the recognition that the most recent set of circumstances caused by the COVID-19 crisis that led to congressional allocations of significant sums of money took place in a context in which there was no increase in taxes. And it makes it very evident that the federal government can spend, it can spend as much as it wants to spend without necessarily increasing taxes, because it does not have to increase the debt when it increases the deficit. It can just make the expenditure. It doesn't have to borrow to do so. The only barrier to additional government spending for any purpose, and I'm embracing modern monetary theory here quite openly. The only barrier to additional government spending is the inflation risk. And to the extent that you can mitigate the inflation risk with the design of your expenditure program, then there's no limitation on the capacity of the government to finance a project of this type. And we even suggest, and From Here to Equality, that the funding could be spread over the course of a decade with the objective of eliminating racial wealth differences. And that, this is clearly something that could be done. You could actually have the Federal Reserve finance it on an annual basis, because, $1 to $2 trillion per annum is not very different from the amount of outlays that they make for quantitative easing.
I like all of these ideas, and I think it's a great idea to propose this as a project whereby taxes wouldn't need to be increased, because I know that that's the Achilles heel of American politics. On the other hand, however, I want to point to a positive example in Germany when East Germany was rebuilt after reunification. The West German government, or the unified German government, introduced a solidarity tax that has been on the books for, well, ever since 1989 or 1990 or something like that, whereby everybody pays a tax that goes to rebuilding East Germany, and it was quite successful, and people didn't protest too much as long as they understood the need for solidarity. And this is where I'm getting back to my little optimism from my implicit racial attitudes research. In the research, I found that people can at the same time have anti-Black associations on top of their minds, and at the same time identify with African Americans in politically meaningful ways. So the two implicit attitudes exist at the same time. And it's basically up to us making the argument so that that identification element with African American leads to political solidarity. And there are several ways this could be done, and there are several historical examples of how that was done. For example, during the late 19th century, there was a movement for slave pensions that was supported by Kelly House, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. An initiative by Kelly House, who was African American, formerly enslaved, and Frederick Douglass supported it. And on the other side, a number of of Confederates supported it. Former Confederates, for example, Edmund Pettus, after whom the bridge is named, he supported the bill because he felt that reparations for African Americans, or pensions back then, pensions for African Americans enslaved would benefit the Southern economy by providing a stimulus. And that stimulus argument can be used for reparations today, and it would make perfect sense, especially after a crisis like this, to say we need stimulus, and the best stimulus is a morally consistent one, where the victims of an injustice are being repaid, rather than what happened after the financial crisis of 2008, where the very bankers who caused the crisis were being provided with spending money. So
yeah, a very Keynesian argument from the ex-Confederates. Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thank you all for having us. This is great. It's great to share the stage with Professor Craemer.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Take care.
Thank you, Bo.